Hello, and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Renew Economy and founder and editor of its EV-focused sister site, The Driven. And joining me, as usual, is RTK principal David Leitch. David, I trust you are well, not causing too much problem headaches for our medical system.
Hi. Someone once told me, actually it was my brother Giles, and this is really not a propos of anything, many, many years ago when he was starting as a medical student. So this would be back in I don't know when, but it was so long ago at Dreamtime, that about 50% of all the money that's spent on a person's health is spent in the last year of their life. And that's one of those fascinating financial things that I've been thinking about ever since. But I don't think we should let that get in the way of the fact that we have got an outstanding guest this week, don't we?
We do indeed. I just want to sort of also just add that I hope this is not your last year of your life, and that's the reason for your medical expenses. I mean, I just been trying to be a little bit more optimistic. Look, we are about to receive two bits of information. Well, the Climate Change Authority has prepared its recommendations to the federal government. I'm not too sure whether they're already in the federal government's hands or not. The federal government, as far as I can work out, is about to announce its 2035 emissions reduction target, which is a key for many people, not least the industry in Australia, the economy as a whole in Australia, but also these people concerned about climate change. It's important for its UN obligations, meeting the Paris Treaty, perhaps its hopes of hosting the UN climate conference next year. So much to think about. And your bright idea, David, was to invite one of the most eminent climate scientists in the world, the CSIRO's chief research scientist, Pep Canadell, who's also the executive director of the Global Carbon Project. And what a great idea that was, and what a great interview it was. Let's have a listen with our talk with Pep Canadell.
Pep Canadell, thanks very much for joining the Energy Insiders podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, pleasure's mine.
For those that don't know, Pep was named as one stage not so long ago as the 8th most influential climate scientist in the world. I've known his work for many years as the one of the lead authors on the Global Carbon Project, which is the absolute reference if you want to understand in easy to look at figures. Where we are in carbon emissions and the cause of them analysed in many different ways. And I want to congratulate you, Pep, because I think last week you were made a Fellow of the Academy of Sciences here in Australia to go with being a Fellow of a number of other academies of science around the world.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. So I thought I might start by just asking you a little bit about the global state of the climate. And in particular, I've seen some literature from people like Zeke Housefather that perhaps there's some evidence that climate change is accelerating a little bit at the moment. What would you say about that?
So, yeah, it's depending whether we take a longer view or a shorter view. So the longer view is that climate change has been quite linearly growing for many decades. And it's interesting to even go back to the projections 30 years ago from the IPCC itself and the scientific community in general to see that mostly we got quite right those projections, on where we will be going today. Now, those projections have large uncertainty. And what's happening over particularly the last 5 years and the last decade, but particularly the last 5 years, that we are more on the higher end of those projections. So we're still within the uncertainties, but kind of more on the higher end. Now, there's quite a few things that have happened that would explain partially or totally, this potential acceleration, which again, it's a bit of a debate, nowadays. But as I said, we're on the higher end. So, we continue to increase emissions, globally, and these emissions, continue to accumulate so that you have the effect of the current emissions are growing, plus all the emissions that you put in the past. But at the same time, there was a very specific thing that happened in 2020, which was the International Maritime Organization enforced new upper limits of sulfur content in the fuels, what we call the bunker fuels used by the shipping industry. These are very highly polluting fuels, and they produce sulfur dioxide, which is a really important aerosol. And aerosols reflect basically, incoming solar radiation back to outer space. So having a lot of pollution means that we have a little cooling. And so these past 5 years, we've seen a really dramatic reduction of sulfur dioxide. And we think that's largely due to this new implementation and implementation of the upper limits of sulfur. And we are seeing additional warming coming in, a warming that we have always expected was going to come, not necessarily in 2020 or the last 5 years because the implementation of a new policy, but it's something that even the climate models do actually have, that as we clean we move away from fossil fuels, we'll be polluting less, we'll have less aerosols, and we'll be unmasking more warming that was masked by these aerosols, and as much as 0.5 degree can actually, be expressed.
I'll get to a couple of approximate numbers in a little moment. I think also I read that you had made a comment that the available sinks were not had been used up to some extent, whether it was land clearing in Sweden or the Amazon, or is that also the case?
Yeah, so it is the case that the land sinks have been changing quite dramatically recently. And again, particularly in this last 5 years that we've seen such a warming records happening ones after the other. They're less influential as per the changes we've seen in the actual global mean value of the temperature. So we need bigger things to happen, almost 1 year to another, as I express on the emissions growth and on the aerosols. Now, having said that, yes, we've seen some of the biggest atmospheric CO2 growth on record in 2024. We have never seen anything, as big, which basically means that more carbon dioxide we emit stays in the atmosphere, and what we call the natural CO2 sinks, which on average remove about half of all CO2 emissions, and that is the natural sinks, the oceans, and the land ecosystems, whether vegetation, tropical forests, grasslands. They have removed much less. Again, that's not enough to make those massive changes we've seen in the temperature, but in the long run, will have a huge impact indeed in the accumulation of CO2 and therefore warming.
And so I think would I be right in saying that at the current rate of CO2 emissions, we're in line for somewhere between 0.25 and maybe as much as 0.3 degrees centigrade of warming a decade?
Yeah, so I mean, the last decade, we had very close to 0.3 degree of centigrade, which is almost double what we've seen on average on the previous century. But again, this is the response of the large amounts of carbon that we put into the atmosphere and the fact that they accumulate in the atmosphere. So you have all the historical accumulation there. And yeah, so unless we change tack here, we are on a trajectory of really, close to 0.3 degree per decade, which you just make the calculations, in 50 years, we are well past 2.5 degrees above pre-industrial. I mean, it's not too complicated to think where we're going.
I want to come back to some questions about consequences of that, because for various reasons, but I think I just wanted to ask again that I've also read several times, and I apologize for such junior burger questions, but I'm really not a scientist, and I always find my climate change discussions a lot more challenging for me, and I hope you can communicate to the audience. But the carbon that we release actually stays in the atmosphere, unless it's man-made, removed, for about 1,000 years. Is that right?
Yeah, so the way to think about it is that it's not that there is a lifespan of the CO2 in the atmosphere. What it does is that, imagine that we put 1 ton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today from burning fossil fuels. That ton, there'll be about 400 kilos still remaining in the atmosphere after 100 years. We'll still have 20%, 200 kilos after 1,000 years, and we'll still have 100 kilos of that 1 ton 10,000 years later. So in a way, it never quite
You never get rid of it completely.
exactly, and you do get rid of eventually, but it just takes thousands of years, which is not relevant to our current enterprise of trying to stabilize the climate.
And I'll come back later on, but just on the observational side of things, and I assume that no matter what is happening in America, we still got good observational ability through satellites and whatever. But I think another sort of more steady record is the rate of growth in ocean temperatures, and that also seems to show some rate of acceleration. I think we've seen numbers up around 30 zettajoules, which I think if compares with all the coal and oil and gas energy that we mine each year, is about half a zettajoule. So 30 is a lot more than that, isn't it, really?
Yeah. So 90% of all extra energy that we put into the atmosphere because the greenhouse gas effect from our own activities goes into the ocean. So the ocean is just basically fixing most of the problem for us. Otherwise, we'll be already cooking in the atmosphere in the places we live. And we've seen huge, unprecedented records of temperature in the global oceans, in the last 10 years, particularly, which has led even into global records of temperature, air temperature, during years which was not even an El Niño year, which is when usually have all the big temperature records. So even during a La Niña year, we had a global record temperature which had not been seen before.
I'm wondering, Pep, if you can just sort of, I mean, it's depressing to hear all these different things which are happening. I mean, how much of this kind of is a surprisingly worse scenario than what you were expecting, say, 5 or 10 years ago, or how much was it sort of foreseen? Are you shocked by what you by what you're seeing?
So the answer is no. I mean, literally, if you look at 30 years ago, the kind of projections we were doing through the IPCC, they're largely round spot. Again, we provide uncertainties. I just mentioned that we're maybe a little on the higher end of those trajectories. But what's different is that when we say climate extremes will increase by 30%, or intensity of a heat wave will increase by, it's very difficult to make sense out of it. At a personal level, I mean, how do you make sense of those graphs and those percentages? Now what has changed is that 2/3 of the world population has personally experienced massive climate events that they had not experienced in their own life, whether they were a 15-year-old boy or a girl or a 75-year-old man. So we are experiencing things that they're completely out of the records in our, kind of the last 200-year records. And that's what's really changing very rapidly, that more and more people kind of realize what climate change is, and we're no longer talking or looking at those figures. We are just basically experiencing very personally those heat waves, those floodings in ways that we have not seen before.
You wrote earlier this year that no matter how we look at global temperatures and its evolution in the years ahead, we already knew there's now ample evidence that the Paris Agreement's most important goal of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees has been missed. And unless more aggressive action on mitigation is taken quickly, so too will the goal of avoiding temperatures below 2 degrees. And you further write, this is not a reason to throw in the towel, but rather to sharpen the climate and energy policies that will lead us to a decarbonised world. Australia is about to announce within the next week its own 2035 targets, and it's going to be interesting to see where it lands there. I fear that everything might be back in the too hard basket in terms of sort of costs and the lack of identification of benefits. But maybe to help that along, you could explain what is the difference between a 1.5 degrees world and maybe a 2 degrees and a 2.5 degrees world?
So, this is a very difficult question. IPCC ran an entire special report, what we call the 1.5C report. And in that report, actually look at quite carefully that very question. And what we see in terms of the big difference is that every decimal of a temperature, it's making actually a huge difference. When we think about the big climate extremes we've seen, the big heat waves we've seen, completely record heat waves, as an example, over the last 10 years, some of these things are so unprecedented. They led to so much, early premature death, but not in the sub-Sahara world or in the developing country world. We're talking about European rich countries. We're talking about in the northwest of Canada, when we had the big heat dome in 2000, I think it was 2021. I mean, there were like dozens of people who died, hundreds of people who died in Europe of premature because the high exposure to heat. So, we're really seeing things that are very unprecedented and at, not even at 1.5. So last year, it was the first year that we were on mean average for the whole year, 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. Now, in the terms we define 1.5 degrees in the IPCC, and when Paris Agreement says 1.5 degrees for the Paris Agreement target of stabilization, what we mean is an average at least 10 years. So we are now, on average, 10 years about less than 1.3 above pre-industrial. So here we are, less than 1.3 over pre-industrial, and we see the things we've seen. We're not even at 1.5. And now you ask me, whether 2 will going to make a bigger difference. The thing is that even where we are now, it's a place that we would rather not to be. And, we still need to kind of completely pass the system approach of 1.5. That's going to happen over the next few years, not too many years. By the end of the decade, certainly we are in a permanent place of minimum 1.5 at 1.5, and then 2 degrees. I think that we're looking at seeing some exponential growth of some of these big impacts, climate extreme events.
I'll hand back to David, but just one more question on this particular line. I mean, you said that sort of people are now starting to feel this, and sort of the results across the globe, people are experiencing it. Are you seeing any sort of tangible evidence that politicians are getting it sufficiently that they're going to do something about it?
Well, that's a difficult question for a scientist. So I think that we do see we're doing a lot of things. Here, the big issue is that are we doing things fast enough to be able to avoid, the wars of climate change? But there's no doubt that, things are happening quickly. And I think that's important. Even if the Paris Agreement were to be very successful, let's say we stay well below 2 degrees, whatever well below 2 degrees is, we still are looking at the next 50 years, and you can think about the next 2 generations as constant warming. So basically, being successful means that we might be able to stabilize the climate, but from today to that stabilization point, we're still looking at least 50 years of continued warming, and therefore continue increasing of this exponential, these climate extreme impacts that we're already seeing now at not even, as I said, 1.3 average global surface temperature.
And so at 0.3 a decade, we're really going to hit 2, aren't we? I mean, I hate to say that, but that as speaking as an investment banking analyst and making my forecasts, it seems a likely bet.
There's no reason why we cannot change our minds and go full sail on decarbonization. I mean, we had certainly plenty of global leaders who, it seemed that they wanted to push that. They might not last too long in place, but, the same way things we see going very wrong very quickly in some places, in some countries, we have also seen them, going very well very quickly in some other countries. And I think that, I do want to highlight an example that I always give, which is the Biden administration in the US really did absolutely incredible things to push, a green revolution. And it was bipartisan, so it was really powerful. And I think that, there's no reason why we cannot see more of these things.
And I think you have done a lot of work in the area of land and clearing and land sinks and things like that. I might be wrong about that, but in terms of policy, I think you observed that China, for instance, has moved from being a net source of land clearing to a sink because they've had a very consistent policy of re-greening China. Can those sort of policies make much of a difference to the overall thing?
Yeah, so yes, revegetation, reforestation, afforestation, anything that we can do to bring carbon back to the biosphere, it's a good thing. Remember that we have depleted the biosphere of carbon over the last few hundred years of land clearing for agriculture. So there's certainly space to bring some of this carbon back. Now, just to kind of put these things in a global perspective, I mean, at this point, we're doing enough reforestation globally that about 5% of fossil fuel emissions are offset with that amount. And as you mentioned, the single biggest contributor to afforestation is China. About 2/3 of all afforestation we see globally has taken place over the last 50 years in China, and not for climate change reasons. The reasons they did that was because they have depleted the agricultural resources and soils, because they had dust storms coming from the degraded lands outside of Beijing, covering the entire city with heavy dust. And they've done incredible ecological restoration over many years. Many has failed because it's a semi-arid. There's a strong semi-arid component to that reforestation they've done, but they've done so much that still they've been overall very successful. Now, there's no reason why programs like this one, under the banner of climate change, not just dust storms or degradation, but remember that we have a lot of degraded land, so there's a lot of potential opportunities there to also bring, good carbon, back to the biosphere.
And when you look at it globally, I mean, one of the things, I could ask what we should be looking at to keep an eye on what's going on. Where are the hot spots? So some people want to focus on glaciers in the South Pole, for instance, and the possibility of big sea level rise. I think also the permafrost and albedo is quite a thing, one that we don't often mention on this podcast. But what's going on there?
So there's a few regions that are a big hotspot for us, and we keep an eye very carefully. And you just brought up permafrost as one of them. Permafrost is a really interesting one because the reason we're focusing so much is because there is so much carbon frozen at this point, which basically means that if thawing, which has started already because the very fast rate of warming of the Arctic or boreal region occurs, it's already occurring, so we can potentially emit a lot. So we deploy a whole team of people, for almost 5 years. It's a really interesting story. For almost 5 years to do the net carbon balance of the entire permafrost region. And to our surprise, last decade, the last 2010, 2019, we just published this thing. We just showed that the whole region was between a small to a medium-sized carbon sink. That's the opposite of what every single other person would have ever thought about it. And that's because there's an increase of the growing season, a lengthening of the growing season, which is allowing plants to do photosynthesis and capture carbon for a longer time. Now, that finished in 2019. And since then, we've seen 2021 having the biggest fire season in Siberia ever recorded in our 25 years of remote sensing data. And in 2023, 2024, 2025, the biggest fire seasons in Canada. All these fire seasons in actually good part of the permafrost region. So we went in the space of 5 years from telling you that the region is a carbon sink, a region that the carbon sink is either no longer there or it's even a net source of carbon. And not because the thawing that you thought was the most important thing, but because the changes in the fire regime due to drought and the large amount of carbon both in soils and in the forest. So it's a fascinating story, completely not exactly what we thought was happening there, and happened very quickly.
And so that's I used to see that in financial markets all the time, that things happen in very unexpected ways. And no matter how much life is sometimes even more complex. And I think also we see an example of that in Australia, where I know you did a major report for the government on the bushfires. But in fact, nature's inherent strengths and I guess nature's experience with bushfires has meant we've actually had a pretty good recovery from them here, have we not?
Yeah, so yeah, fire is very different in very different parts of the world. Like the reason why boreal regions are so important with fire emissions is because once you burn the forest, it takes decades to regrow, and the burning of the organic soil, it might take centuries to recover. Now you come to Australia, and we have very fire adapted vegetation, and so we've seen an extraordinary recovery of carbon, not recovery of the forest. Remember that one thing is growth, the other is whether the ecosystem has recovered with the biodiversity and the structure and the function. But from a plant growth and resprouting, we've seen incredible. I mean, we've seen even places where there's been even more carbon now than we had before the fire. Of course, we came from 2 years of drought, so that's not a huge surprise, but it is a huge surprise that the resprouting and the regrowth took place, so quickly after. Now, the previous study we did in terms of fire frequency changes in forests, actually we show that the fire return interval is becoming shorter and shorter very quickly. And it has become so short in places like in the Alpine Arch, in Victorian Alps, and New South Wales, where if there is full destruction of the forest, burning of the forest requires at least 20 years to recover. And at this point, we're already at fire intervals of less than 15 years, which basically means that at this point, there is reseeding of those forests in an attempt to, help them to recover after fire, because fire frequency has become now so high. So we're beginning, even in Australia, with so much well-adapted vegetation, we're beginning to see, the first signs of trouble in the most sensitive regions, which is this eucalyptus that do not resprout. They need to reseed from the ground.
And Pep, I'll hand back to Giles in a minute, but I think I ask every client scientist that we have on this fairly difficult, what I perceive as fairly difficult question about the interaction between La Niña and El Niño and climate change, where it seems to me climate change could be making La Niña worse, or El Niño worse, or it might not be. And in turn, El Niño and La Niña are known to exacerbate climate change. And so let me just ask that simple question. What's the sort of current latest thinking on that?
Yeah, so the IPCC has been struggling to answer this question in a sharp way. And, I think it was not until 2 IPCC reports ago, a number of years, that, it was saying half of the models are saying that things are going to get worse, the others saying that nothing is going to happen, or no major change is detectable. I think that the knowledge at this point is that it's unclear that there's going to be any influence in the frequency of these cycles, but that we can see some increase in the intensity of the cycles. Now, we have always learned that there's many different types of El Niños, and particularly El Niños, and that some types might show a stronger strength in the drought, in at least in Australia, and others, they may not be as clear. So if anything is emerging at this point in terms of consensus, will be the strength of these El Niño La Niñas that could increase.
And so we've also got like the Indian Ocean dipole that we see on the weather every night, and then the southern annular mode. I can barely remember the letters. And I think that one thing that does directly affect Australia is the weather. Obviously, every Australian notices, and nearly all of us live on the coast. And so the fact that the oceans near the coast are warming up and ocean currents seem to be changing, is there any sort of consensus about what's climate change and how it's going to affect all of those things? I mean, obviously the ocean's going to get warmer, but then I guess the question is, what does the warmer ocean do on average to the currents and the winds?
Yeah, so I won't be able to answer this question well enough. There's all these various modes. They sometimes they interact at the same time. They express themselves at the same time. We have these extreme events, in Australia. Each one obeys different specific climate components. And yes, I'm not on top of enough, what is the very latest on each of the systems.
I was going to ask actually about the Gulf Stream, and I can't remember what the sort of the proper name for that current is over in the Atlantic, but there's been sort of more concerns about that sort of already slowing down and the impact that could have. If it could even sort of stop. I'm not too sure. Maybe that's also outside of your bailiwick, but
yeah. Well, there's been quite a bit of science lately, and I think the science begins to be a little more consistent. So I think, well, first of all, we call it the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and the important thing is that there is now a study that shows that we are detecting already now a bit of a slowdown. Now, whether this thing can be translated into an effective climate change, that's different. So there's a bit of concern there. Now, there's a lot of other studies that they do show that if we push the climate towards the higher end of our scenario exploration, let's call it 4 degrees and higher, that we can have a real slowdown, and they talk about potential collapse. Now, the only one good thing of climate change nowadays is that we believe that those higher end scenarios that IPCC explores systematically, because governments have asked the IPCC, please explore, the very low emission scenarios and the very, very, very high emission scenarios, the ones that you would require the entire economy of the world to begin to almost rely exclusively on coal, liquefied coal, gasified coal, everything coal.
It's nice that they asked.
It's a scenario. It's a scenario that it seems implausible at this point. So that's the only good news of our current condition in terms of where these scenarios are. So yes, we're not off the hook with the AMOC, but there is no reason why things might not occur not at 4 or 5 degrees, but might begin to occur in a much more significant way at a lower end, and that's of course hugely important for the climate of Europe, the monsoons, Africa. So it has global impact.
That brings me back to that same article that I quoted before. I'm going to quote again, actually. You wrote that climate change is like a slippery slope with no bottom. So there is no limit to the damage it can do to our economy, health, and environment. What we want to do is to apply the brakes as hard as we can so that the impacts don't get any bigger. I'm just wondering whether you can just sort of amplify on that last sentence.
Yeah, so sometimes I get the question, are we too late? And we're never too late. The amount of damage that can come from climate change is unlimited. So I think that what we're trying to do is to reduce it to a level that we can manage it from an adaptation point of view, and perhaps ultimately do something to the climate, like removing carbon dioxide emissions to even cool it off and bring it down. Because once we get to a point and we stabilize the climate, if we don't like that climate, well, we're going to be there for many, many, many decades, if not hundreds of years. So I think that what we're trying to say is that there's no limit. So I think we want to keep things at the impacts that we can potentially manage. And of course, we can already see that impacts cannot be managed because we have real consequences of loss of life, loss of nature, loss of biodiversity, loss of economic productivity. We can already assess these things. I mean, look at the big global insurers, the insurance companies, about the insane amount of money that it's being spent in all of these. And actually, it was just recently a report, from the US where a lot of the data it's publicly available. I mean, last year they spent $1 trillion altogether, not just the premiums, but everything, the government, on climate damage. And you can say, well, we always spend a lot of money on climate damage because we have always had hurricanes and tornadoes and all these things. That climate change, it's enhancing, it's making those particular, climate events more intense and or more frequent. So, even if we cannot say what's climate change out of this $1 trillion, as opposed to, what is the background climate, this is a lot of money. In the case of the US, I've just mentioned, this is 3% of the GDP that we could be using on goods and services for Americans. So, and the same in Australia, of course. Some of the numbers are available, some of the numbers are not available. Certainly the ones from the insurance companies are available.
Yeah. Just saying in the US before I hand back to David, I am shocked, and I'm just a layperson, at the war on science it seems to be with the current administration, the eradication of climate data, the closing down of websites, the destruction of programs, the eradication of effectively of the EPA and things like that. What's it like for a climate scientist to see that, to see this war on their science? How do you respond, and how you obviously in contact with people there? Tell us about.
Yeah, no, we have collaborators. We had NASA collaborators that they basically just left their jobs. They were not even fired. They were just said, even if we stay here, we have no money to do anything, to do any science. So, we do a lot of work, globally, of course. And, there's real possibilities that some of the work we're doing might not be able to continue at the same level. We have always relied, as we do on many other things, in the investments of the U.S. in observations, modeling, and satellites. And you at the beginning of the podcast mentioned about satellite. Some of the satellites are being defunded, specific satellites for greenhouse gases. And so it is an issue. These satellites, we are using these satellites globally. People are being using these satellites, and actually they're quite important for Australia, because Australia, we don't have a lot of observations. We have a big continent, not a lot of people. We're a small population, and the satellite information.
But Pep, we have a lot of good scientists here in Australia, and I think I may be wrong about that. Let me ask the simple question first. At the moment, as things stand, is science still a career for someone who's thinking about going to university and has to pay university fees and stuff like that? It takes a long time to get a PhD, which is kind of the absolute minimum requirement to think about a career in science.
Okay, first I'm going to say that yes, you're very right that we have extraordinary good quality science and scientists, and we're certainly punch above where we are in terms of population. And that is seen very well every time that there is an IPCC and Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where we are very well represented when you compare it to even the Americans, actually. Anyway, so absolutely yes. I don't think it's ever been so exciting to be a scientist. There's just so much going on, so much that we need to learn, so much that we need to know to take very important decisions. We're talking about climate change. It had started many decades ago as kind of an environmental study. And, it is now something that permeates through absolutely everything in society, throughout the entire economy, from end to end. Everything that we do has a greenhouse consequence and has become this big thing. And the decarbonization path, which we are on the way, the big question is that, how long is it going to take us? And is it going to take us too long and we're going to see too much damage? But, it requires so much research and development, so much scientific input, so much engineering and technical input. I think that to being a young person is incredibly exciting and concerning at the same time, but exciting nevertheless for a study point of view to get into science, or doesn't have to be just science, even humanities. Everything is on. We need everything on this decarbonization journey.
I might say, when I was doing a little bit of research on this and I Googled, and there was a YouTube video of some fairly young person, still at school, I think, or maybe at university, with a Barcelona shirt. And he made a 1-minute video saying his role model was Pep Canadell for the work he'd done on the Global Carbon Project. So I think to be a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science and a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, part of the team, and also to have someone saying you're a role model is a pretty good thing. But more to the point, it seems to me that some people want to focus very much on Australian manufacturing, which in my experience, we're actually only so at compared to other countries in the world and have no natural comparative advantage. But it seems to me that in education and in science education, that it's an area where skills, if we had them, could be quite in demand globally, because in the end, science is the kind of basic foundational block for productivity and progress. And it's an area where a bit more funding and government investing might produce better return on capital than in some other areas.
Last week, the Academy of Science, Australian Academy of Science, they published a report about the scientific capability or the STEM capability required over the next, I think that was over the next decade. And it's so impressive to see the demand that is expected from science, technology, mathematics. You just go geoscience, one thing after another. There is a demand that, they're saying, unless we do something, we will be, you will be well short to what is required to both have, a very, very healthy economy here in Australia. But as you said, we scientists, and you'll tell because my accent, I came from elsewhere, and we're very mobile because that's what, be a scientist, that's required in big part. So yes, I think that the potential is large, both nationally and internationally. And yes, we do have to have the investments to really allow this to fully develop.
I'm going to hand back to Giles in case he has it, but I'm just like to offer you an open floor. Is there anything you'd like? I mean, we have a pretty good audience here. I mean, Chris Bowen swears he listens to the podcast every week. I don't actually believe that, but he says so.
I think he does actually, because he keeps on sending me comments saying, "Oi."
And as possibly, there's a lot of candidates to be regarded as one of the top climate scientists in Australia. What would you like to say to our audiences?
I think that as much as we are, and we should be very concerned about the climate change that is coming up and the impacts, I think that at the same time is this incredible opportunity to really, develop this new society in a way that, we make it, cleaner and smarter. And it's like all the things that in part we want to do almost anyway. And climate is forcing us to do it very quickly. But all the things we're doing, like getting energy from the sun, this kind of thing, in a way, it makes so much sense from a sustainability point of view.
It does to me. I have to say that, whether it's electric cars and energy independence, in the case of conflict, or just taking advantage of the natural resources that we have in the solar and the wind, it just seems so blindingly obvious. I can't understand why we're still even arguing. I can. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah. No. I think that you just said it. I mean, the opportunities are plentiful. It's a direction we want to go no matter what. And it's the direction that's going to make us all better off at the end. It's not that we're trying to say, sorry, in order to solve this climate problem, we just now all need to stop doing everything so that we can actually save on. No, we're not saying this thing. We're saying that, yes, we need to rationalize some of our consumption, energy consumption, but at the same time, we're so many times smarter, society that we can actually engage in a really true transformation of our economy and energy systems, and in part our land systems as well, which are contributing to the problem, to have a more sustainable future.
Look, Pep, I think I'm out of questions. Well, I've actually got a lot, but I kind of feel like it's kind of rolling over. But I'd just like to thank you for your contribution, just to this podcast, but also just to the scientific knowledges in general, and for your ongoing continuing efforts. And, fingers crossed that we do find a way to embrace this society that you say could be cleaner, smarter, more efficient, more healthy, more sustainable. It's a constant frustration that we seem to find roadblocks to put in front of us, but the roadblocks of self-interest and denial. It was ever thus. But you sort of feel like we're at another. I don't know. I mean, do you sort of feel that we're at another one of these moments now, or is it just another moment?
I think that in a way, it's exciting to be able to be part of this massive social and technical transformation as we have not seen it in the last 200 years, even if we went through already a first industrial revolution. I think that this is much more exciting, and the opportunities and the actual jobs, and thinking for young people, as concerned as they are and they should be on the climate change coming into the future, I think that the opportunities are many times bigger and better than maybe what we had many years ago.
It's only so many people. We all try to make a difference, but I think some of us make more of a difference than others. So it's great, and I do hope if there are any young people listening that they see that this is such an exciting field. I mean, what Giles and I do in terms of analysis and discussion, and we like to think we make a little difference too in our own way. So and it's a reason to get up in the morning, isn't it? But thank you very much, Pep.
Thank you for inviting me, and also thank you for your great podcast, which I'm one of your 10,000 listeners.
Well, thank you very much. And that's a wonderful note to end on. Pat on the back. Thank you very much, Pep. And thanks, David, for the idea of bringing this interview to this podcast at this important time. You're listening to the Energy Insiders podcast with Giles Parkinson and David Leitch. David, that was a really fascinating interview or discussion with Pep, sometimes, well, insightful, a little bit bleak, slithers of hope. What did you make of it?
It was generally entertaining, which is what I always striving for. I must say, and as I intimated during the interview, and we shouldn't spend too much time on it, but one, I invite every listener who hasn't had a look at the Global Carbon Project, which is now maintained by the University of Exeter, and you have to hunt through their links a little bit just to get the PDF presentation. But I encourage everyone who listens to this podcast to actually look at that presentation. It's been the go-to piece of work for me ever since about 2007 or 2008, where you can see carbon emissions dissected and stratified in many different ways, by country, by per capita, by GDP, by fuel, but a lot of other stuff as well that I think is really well worth looking at. But of course, that's only a presentation of data. I'm sure the actual research is the far more fundamental thing, and I wish for myself that I was more qualified to ask questions that were more on the margin. But nevertheless, yes, it was a great interview.
No, it was really interesting. Just in the context of the federal government's 2035 emissions target, which could be announced next week, or maybe it might be the week after, where do you think it should be, and where do you think it might actually land?
Giles, in a way, a target is an aspiration, unless the question is what will be in place to incentivise that target, which can be anything from legislation, which is a stick, which forces things to happen, like certificate. You could have a certificate system that forces generators to have so much, retailers to have so much renewable energy as we've had in the past. We have vehicles emissions standards. Then there are incentive policies that you can kind of get with a carbon price or tax. There are various ways, but in the end, the target, the aspiration, talk is cheap. To put it in a nutshell, it's great to have a big target, but really, what's backing it up?
Well, I think one of the things that we will see from this report and from the federal government's announcement, that there will be sector by sector, well, I don't know whether they're going to be targets, but action sort of programs.
Yes, I think that's
and I think that's going to be the actual key, actually, probably more than the number. The number's going to disappoint someone because it's either going to be too high or too low or two in the middle. In fact, it's going to disappoint a lot of people, and it's just been interesting just seeing some of the sort of the preparations and the rhetoric, and you kind of think that they're sort of preparing us for a lower than what we would have hoped number, but possibly with the potential for the upside. And if we can get these sort of 5 sector or these however many sector plans, that could be actually more important than the number itself.
Yes, and plans are one thing. Achieving plans is another thing. We've seen in the electricity sector how hard it is to get to the 80% target, which is a difficult ask already. And so everyone listening to this podcast knows that they can do their little bit to make something happen. And it really is the collective will of all of us that will make decarbonisation possible, not in the very end, I don't think, a government target.
Well, that's true. And more than just the click to will at the moment, because the battery rebate seems to do quite well, and that's encouraging more people to put on rooftop solar. And I actually think, and we're starting to see some more stories about this, including on our website, just about how fundamental a change, or how fundamental, it kind of feels like we're moving into that next phase of this.
Did you see that Aldi deal?
Yeah, I know. You got Bunnings a couple of weeks ago coming out and saying we're selling solar and batteries. Now you got Aldi in the centre aisle.
I mean, just let's talk about the numbers. Let's talk about the numbers. For $9,000 or less, Aldi will offer you a 6.5 kilowatt solar system with a 20 kilowatt hour battery. Like a Tesla Powerwall alone was, $17,000 a year ago, or $14,000, or whatever number you happened to pay on the week it was. Now you're getting, something that's 80% bigger and with a 6.5 kilowatt solar system thrown in, all from your friendly discount store.
Absolutely, yeah. And look, I think that's just changing. It's just changing the nature of the grid. It's making the retailers think very carefully about how the energy retailers, how they sort of structure their business. It's providing all sorts of opportunities for innovators to come in and provide sort of different sort of packages. It's getting the regulators and the policymakers and the market operators thinking differently about how they manage that, how they incentivize that. I mean, we heard from SAP and Andrew Bills last week. I think it's really quite fundamental, and the cheery side of the fact that we're doing such precious little on the large scale side.
Yeah, well, that I'll come back to that, but I mean, I have to say, for all the talk we've had about EV batteries and EV to the grid, simple little government policy, and bingo, we're back to meat and 3 veg, aren't we? And all happier for it.
Yeah. Getting back to the large scale stuff, I mean, you did a lot of research and a lot of work on where all the wind farms have gone, and
I haven't gone anywhere, Giles. That's the main problem. I wish they would go somewhere.
Or get built. Yes. Can you just give us a bit of a summary about what you found? I mean, apart from the fact that they're not being built.
Well, the EPCB reforms will come too late. The simple fact is that once a project disappears into that process, it never seems to come out. And Murray Watt had his regional planning thing, which is great. I'm all in favour of that. I think it's a great reform, but to me, it's only number 2 at best on the list. Number 1 on the list would be a defined time frame for a project to get into that process and then come out. So, and then some projects are just waiting for transmission. Another thing that I didn't bring out in my note is that costs have definitely shot up a huge amount, and I think this causes hesitation all around the place, both from developers, but also from people who are going to buy the electricity. You can look at the US PPI indexes and see transformers have got up 80%. Humble little transformer, just a piece of wire, as far as I know, around up 80% over the last 5 years, and a lot of other cost increases. So there's a few things going on, but what I found disappointing was that projects in the southwest zone, some of which do have capacity infrastructure CIS awards, none of them have actually got all their environmental approvals done yet. That transmission will be available in 2027. And not one of the projects that's going to connect it to it has actually started. And we want to build like 3 gigawatts or whatever the number is there. People have got to get on with it.
Yeah, they do indeed. They do indeed. And it's going to be interesting, actually, when we see the emissions reduction target that is set by the government, particularly if it comes in a bit low, whether that actually sort of results in a tacit admission that 2030 target is not going to be met. And it's going to be very hard to meet, because basically, that sort of, even the step change target is dependent on, at least a doubling of what we've achieved in the last few years. So,
well, Giles, I think what it is that the CIS is a great scheme, but it's not enough as it stands on its own to actually make those projects get the go-ahead. What I would say is that, speaking around the traps, there's a number of developers that are hopeful of getting to FID in the second half of 2026. And if you look at a good wind farm build, which would be, say, Golden Plains, it took the best part of 3 years from the time it got to FID, or about 2.5 years after getting from when it actually started building, to get, it's like 750 megawatts done. So if you got to FID in the second half of 2026, if you did, then you could still be hitting your 2030 number.
Okay. Do we really have to wait until the second half of 2026?
This year, as I said in the note, I expect 2 wind farms in South Australia to get the go-ahead, good old South Australia. That would be Barn Hill and Palmer Wind Farm, for those people that care, which between them add up to about 700.
All our listeners.
No, well, some do and some don't, but there's a lot of wind farms and a lot of names, and a lot of people think about solar and batteries and don't think wind ever got a viable future. I had a kind of cut off in that when I did that list of like about 250 megawatts, but it's been pointed out on your great website that in fact the Delburn Wind Project as well, another 200 megawatts in Victoria, will probably get to go ahead. So in the next few months, I think we'll get close to a gigawatt up to FID, but we need 17, 20 gigawatts.
Okay. One moment I was feeling very positive, and the other moment I'm going, "Oh shit!"
It's a big job
to do. It's a big job.
Now
Yes.
the other thing that I think is interesting to talk about is when we were talking about costs, is actually the turbines themselves. Vestas, if you look at it, their turbine price is about 1.1 million euros per megawatt, and that's broadly the same number, up about 9% over 5 years, and they're not making much money. But in A dollars, that's gone up a lot to about $1.8 or $1.9 million a megawatt. If you look at the latest Goldwind financial results, and admittedly nearly all their megawatts happen in China, so, can we translate that? Their cost was $0.48 million a megawatt in Aussie dollars. So about a quarter of the Vestas price if both were expressed in Australian dollars. Now, I don't know how much it costs to get when you translate that into Australia, but it does seem to me that we could all, if we, I don't want to be advocating for one or the other, but it does seem to me that there's such a big cost gap there that people ought to be looking at it very seriously. And while I'm thinking about another project that get the go-ahead, I hope this year is the Coppabella Wind Farm in southern New South Wales, close to your mate Angus Taylor.
Hi, Angus. Be great to catch up again. Look, the data I'm seeing is that people are sort of factoring in at least sort of 3 million a megawatt, I think.
Oh, at least.
Yes, at least to build. What's interesting about that, you mentioned those two, Vestas and Goldwind, which has sort of dominated the market, apart from say Nordex, which is building McIntyre, and which is happening reasonably slowly because it was pretty much their first project in Australia.
Not as slowly as Ungula, but pretty slowly. Yeah.
Pretty slowly. There's also Envision, which has just arrived in Australia with intentions to crack into the wind market, but they probably need a project under their belt as well. They may be advised to do a small project rather than a gigawatt scale project, just to get their head and their engineers around the GPS, the generation performance standards, and so that might be a while before they can actually sort of deliver, cost competitive turbines.
Now, Giles, you went to the Smart Energy conference in Queensland this year. What were your main takeaways?
Hey, Queensland's a bugger of a place at the moment.
I'm sorry to hear that. I feel empathy with my near neighbours from Armidale, Queenslanders.
Well, look, Queensland's a lovely place, but I mean, to build renewable energy projects, it's just sort of chaotic and a bit in crisis. A lot's going on up there. You've got the LNP coming in, threatening to rip up the renewable energy targets. They haven't actually done that yet. Threatening to rip up their emissions reduction. Well, no, they actually promised to keep the emissions reduction target, but now the suspicion is that they'll probably change that as well. We're waiting for the new energy plan to be released in early October. The person doing that, David Janetsky, he's the energy minister and the treasurer, and all the people who have dealt with him seem to think that he's quite reasonable.
That's my word.
Yep, and that's not a view that is offered to
but he's not the
planning minister. That's right. So you've got this planning minister, a guy called Jared Blair, I think we mentioned him in the podcast last week, who's councilled 2 wind farms already. He's just called in another 2 wind farms. That Forest wind farm that we actually talked about last week, there's questions about the legality of what he's done.
There's
questions about whether, I know what you're going to say, but anyway, but there's also questions about why he's done it. Did he consult with cabinet? So he's a bit of a rogue there, and basically the observation is that he really doesn't like wind. He really is trying to stop it, but he's actually been quite clever about the way he's going about it, and people are not really too sure how to stop it.
No, well, I won't comment on on that side of things, but I did want to comment that last week on the podcast, I said that Forest Wind AGL walked away from its involvement because of the economics. As I understand, it's not the economics that are the issue; it's the tenure.
Well, there you go. Yeah, and it was interesting to. Can't remember now whether we mentioned this in the podcast last week, but the reason for knocking it back was that it hadn't yet been developed, and they wanted to save the forest, and it's a frigging pine plantation, which is going to be cut down in the next 10 or 12 years anyway. So but there's all sorts of local factors going on. I mean, it's just not one thing or the other, but it just shows how difficult it is, and yet there are so many wind projects that could be built in Queensland. Queensland remains the state with the most coal-dependent grid. You've got members running around saying we want to keep on burning coal for decades longer. That just doesn't fit in with anything that we really need to be doing.
Another thing I gathered from some of my conversations, something I don't really understand, is that some of the issues around McIntyre relate to the New South Wales-Queensland link. And, when McIntyre suddenly stops going, or if it does, there are kind of system-level issues that have to be considered. So I personally have long advocated for building more wind in Queensland and at the same time strengthening the New South Wales-Queensland interconnector. I'm sure by now our listeners are bored of me saying that the wind in Queensland blows at a different time to the wind in the south and is much stronger in winter. And consequently, it's a great portfolio option. And it just is, I won't say any more.
No, fair enough, yeah. Look, there's some sort of issues happening at McIntyre. How serious they are, we don't really know. It's been sort of in commissioning for well over a year now. It's less than halfway through its hold point thing, as far as we can tell. There's just very little information coming out of its owner, as it ever has been.
That's the and it's run by the CC ex-CEO, acting CEO. Along with the chair, the amount of information coming out of that place isn't all that high, is it really?
Well, they've got their own conference in Brisbane next week, which I'm also going to. So it'll be interesting to sort of see what information I can get from their perspective.
Well, we've done enough talking now, Giles, but you're Mr. Junkets, I can obviously see that.
Junkets? I've got to hop in my own car and drive it up and pay for parking even. I had to do that twice on Monday. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, I'm not very good at parking. Anyway.
I thought with Teslas, you didn't have to be good at anything. Tesla did everything for you.
Yeah, well, you should just be able to sort of sit off on the street and just sort of say, drive around for a couple of hours and come and pick me up later. But that hasn't happened. And I never believed it would. So there you go. But some people did and spent about $8,000 or $10,000 on their FSD, which is not worth much at the moment, but might be sometime in the future. On that quizzical, cryptic note, David, thank you very much. Thank you, Pep Canadell, for coming on. David, thank you for lining him up and suggesting him. It was really timely to have that just before the new emissions targets are announced. We hope that Matt Ken and Chris Bowen are listening. I'm not sure they are. And thank you to our sponsors, Pylon and Evergen. Thanks for everyone listening out there. Thanks for all the kind comments we receive at every time we do go to a conference. And I got some great feedback on Monday in Brisbane, so very grateful for that. And we'll be back with another episode of the Energy Insiders podcast this time next week. Bye for now.